Inaugural meeting to set up Think and Act platform. I was rather pleasantly surprised when I was asked to come and talk on decolonization, because if it weren't for decolonization, I would not have been sitting in front of you here today. So I owe my entire academic life to the fact that I was one of the first generation of people who grew up in an independent Kenya. And I also benefited enormously from my country, in the sense that opportunities now are open to everybody. And it was because of this that I was able to go to high school, I was able to go to university, and then was able to do my postgraduate work. But again, if we look at the process of decolonization, it's really a global thing. We tend to think that it's something that is related only to those countries that were colonized. But paradoxically, in fact, it was people from the colonies that actually forced the rest of the world to change. So if it weren't for the struggle for decolonization, you know, you would never have had the dynamic America that you have today. You know, you would not have had a dynamic international community as we have today. And I will explain how this came about. And we cannot talk of decolonization without looking at the historical background to struggle for freedom globally. And we tend to think of decolonization as a phenomenon that affected Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But this was a global struggle. It was not something that was uniquely African or uniquely Asian or uniquely Latin American. Because, for example, if all these communities, you know, African, Asian, or Latin American, had not also got the support of men of goodwill, you know, in Europe, in America, in other parts of the world, those who at that time were powerful, the process of decolonization could not really have taken off. And when we talk of decolonization, we have to always bear in mind that certain names stand out, you know, out of very many others. And of course, the name of Mahatma Gandhi, you know, is outstanding, yes. And then of course later, Martin Luther King. But probably many of us don't know that Mahatma Gandhi actually lived in Africa for 20 years. He lived in Durban. And because he was exposed to acts of discrimination, which Africans experienced daily in their lives, not only in South Africa, but actually globally, you know, then would not have had this sweeping struggle against colonialism and imperialism. And Gandhi realized that, you know, it's not about challenging the South African government, you know, it's actually about undermining the whole sweep of imperialism. and he decided that he was going back to India and use that as the base to mobilize anti-colonial forces, first in India, and then that was going to act as a cautionary tale, to imperialists everywhere, and that led to the existence of decolonization movements in different parts of the world. But actually, the story goes back to the tail end of the 19th century, and actually mid-19th century and early 20th century. Because, as we all know, blacks had been enslaved in the United States for over 400 years. And that was one of the reasons for the American Civil War that ended in 1868. So that was a new chapter in American history, because it was because of the issue of slavery that the North forced against the waged a war against the South, and it was not because Northerners were altruistic or wanted to abolish slavery. It was simply that the period coincided with the industrialization of America. So there were now new machines and new factories, and the old order could not operate. So they wanted the slaves emancipated so that they can come and staff the new industries and factories in the North. So these are unintended consequences of some actions that we see. And if you look at the emancipation of blacks in the United States, this led to the emancipation led to segregation. So it took another century until 1964, from 1868 to 1964, almost a century, for blacks to really become free in their own country. And this period gave rise to leaders, because wherever you have certain conditions or situations, then you are going to have people who would come up, to improve the situation, to challenge the situation, to provide leadership. And two outstanding personalities during this period were Booker T. Washington, who set up a school in Alabama, and this school was called the Tuskegee Institute. And the other person was somebody called W.E.B. Du Bois. Yes. Du Bois was the first black graduate of Harvard. And like all blacks, he went to Lincoln University, because that was the only black university in the South. And Booker T. Washington, Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of color. He said this would be the main problem of the 20th century. So he said this is not an American problem, this is a global problem. So this is a famous sentence by W.E.B. Du Bois. The problem of the 20th century would be the problem of color. And these two personalities are very interesting, because you can't understand American history, relatively recent American history, without looking at the role of these two people in transforming American society. They had different perspectives on the issue of the liberation of blacks in the United States. Of course, they had been emancipated. What do you do now? They realized that you can't leave everything to the government. So these were idealists, and every society requires idealists to change. People who would appear to be crazy, or people coming up with crazy ideas that other people are rather cautious about. And Booker T. Washington established a modest school, the Tuskegee Institute, which actually provided technical education, which was mostly manual education. You know, for example, to train carpenters, to train masons, and so on. So these kinds of people, because he said that you may free somebody. You know, a slave can become free, but as long as they don't have education, they don't have skills, they are no better than their past selves. You know, they are just slaves in another name. And this is what inspired him to set up this modest school called the Tuskegee Institute. And this is where early opportunities for education for blacks were appointed. And the Tuskegee didn't only take African American students, but in fact it also took students from Africa. So, for example, there were Somali students who went to Tuskegee Institute, you know, in the 19th century. You know, and students from other parts of the continent who also went to the Tuskegee Institute. So here now you see the convergence of African Americans and Africans in an institution that they never ever imagined, you know, would bring them together. Okay. Later, again in the tail end of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, quite a number of future African leaders went and studied at Lincoln University. Again, this is in the South. And one of those people who studied at Lincoln University was Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first president of Ghana. And Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, again the first president of the Republic of Nigeria, and many others. And one of those classmates of Kwame Nkrumah was somebody called Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall ended up becoming the first black Supreme Court judge of the United States. So he was the first black person to sit in the Supreme Court. And this, of course, is the highest court. And I am proud of Thurgood Marshall because he was the one who later came to write the first Kenyan independent constitution. So the first Kenyan constitution was actually written by this man, Thurgood Marshall, who studied with Nkrumah at Lincoln University. Nkrumah and Du Bois and others later came together, but it was actually Du Bois who said that a black man in the United States can never be free until the African continent is freed. Yeah? So the dignity of black people, wherever they are in the world, is predicated on the freedom of Africa. If Africa is liberated, then black people all over the world are going to be liberated and live in dignity like everybody else. And this was a very prescient, thing that Du Bois thought about. He had great foresight. And then realized that unless African Americans and black people from all over the world come together and try and attack the incubus of racism and imperialism and colonialism, then black people will never be free anywhere. And they will never be free, particularly in the United States. So this gave rise to the establishment of a very, very important institution called the Pan-Africanist Movement. So this was a global movement. It was not a political party. It was just a global movement of blacks with identifiable leaders from amongst the African Americans, the blacks of the Caribbean, and Africa. And in fact, it was this movement that strategized on how people are going to struggle for independence. And of course, struggle for independence is not only a political and military struggle, it's also intellectual. So you can't liberate yourself if you don't liberate yourself intellectually. And how do you liberate yourself intellectually? The only way that you can liberate yourself intellectually is to give priority to education. And education is not about going to school only. It's more than this. It's about educating yourself, developing a reading culture. Because to know about the past, you can't go to an old man and ask them to tell you all that happened in the past. You have to go to books, that have been written about the past. And how do you think about the future? People have thought about the future. And the only way you can know about this is to go and read one of those people who think about the future, the futurologists. Think, about the future, whether these are science fiction writers, whether these are people who write utopian works, and of course those who write on contemporary issues that affect us at the time, at the material time that we are living. So one singular characteristic of all these African or black intellectuals, was that they were extremely well-educated people. And they were not only articulate in expressing their political views, but they were also people who created knowledge. They wrote books. And for example, Du Bois, after graduating from Harvard, went to University of Heidelberg in Germany, to study philosophy. And of course, he graduated in his main area of specialization was sociology. So he became not only a sociologist, but also a historian, a philosopher, and a political scientist. So his works, in fact, were a graphic description of the lives of blacks in a way that had never been written before. And then, of course, later he became a professor and taught in American universities, and also established the first prominent black organization. It was called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, NAACP. Yeah. And interestingly, Merve Kavakji, is a very prominent member of this organization now. So you can see these global connections between men of conscience, and women of conscience, or people who are serious about transforming society, bringing changes in society. So we cannot look at issues, from our own individual or personal perspectives. We have to look at these issues from a much bigger picture. And then, of course, you will find, for example, during the Algerian War of Independence, there was a very, very prominent Caribbean intellectual from Martinique, somebody called Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon wrote a very important book called The Wretched of the Earth, and also Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon was born in Martinique in the French Antilles, the Caribbean, and then went to study medicine in France. And he graduated as a psychiatrist, but chose to go and work in Algeria at a time when Algerians were fighting against the French to drive them out of Algeria. And when he was there, he changed sides. So he did not want to work for the French because he said the French were unjust and wanted to work on the side of justice, and work for the Algerians. And Frantz Fanon was neither a Muslim nor an Algerian. He was neither an Arab nor a Berber. But he was one of these idealistic people who really wanted to change the world. So you can change the world when you are here at Fatih. You can change the world if you are in America. You can change the world if you are in China. Regardless of where you are, as long as you have goals and you are focused on what you want to do. And sometimes we do things that seemingly appear to be unimportant or irrelevant, looked at from the outside. But this is the material of idealists, No matter what people think, about what you are doing, they might look down upon what you are doing. They might think you're not doing anything significant. You're not going to change the world. But still, just keep on doggedly doing whatever you are doing. And of course, it is forums like this that actually you produce future leaders. Because if you are not proactive, if you don't take initiative, you can't be a leader. And we can identify a leader even in our own house. We know one of our brothers, is more dynamic and more forthcoming. He does things, before people ask him or her to do. And everybody in the house are dependent maybe on this person who actually looks quite helpless, but is full of ideas and idealism, in his head. So we mustn't imagine, things that we do are really of no consequence. So Fanon was a classic example of this kind of person. So he engaged both intellectually and practically. And because of his sincerity and commitment, Algerians didn't think him different from other Algerians. They didn't say, you have nothing to do with this. Because Algerians also realized that this is such an enormous task that it cannot be done just by Algerians. It must get help and support from wherever they can get that support. And of course, there were other decolonization movements, as we mentioned earlier. Gandhi led the decolonization of India. And Gandhi was helped by Americans, by Europeans, by other peoples. And this was the strategy that these people developed. They knew that you just can't do things on your own. You can't just do things only with people of your own color, people of your own religion, people of your own kabile, it doesn't work out this way. You have to always subordinate, your narrow interests, to much wider interests. And you will find that all these decolonization movements were multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, because these were all united by consciousness about justice. That people of all backgrounds must fight injustice, wherever it rears its head. And that is how, for example, when India became independent, it gave a lot of scholarships to African students, to students from other parts of Asia to go and study in India. So, for example, in my country, some of those who became prominent lawyers, prominent engineers, prominent professors actually got their early education in India. In fact, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Nairobi, when I was an undergraduate there, Dr. Joseph Karanja, graduated actually from University of New Delhi. You know, so this just tells you that, you know, you must help also. You know, it's not enough for you to be free. You know, because you can't be free when somebody else is not free. You know, unless we are all free, then we are going to be really free. Yeah. So this was the kind of mindset. And you find, for example, Nasser in Egypt also did the same thing. You know, gave scholarships to African students to go and acquire, you know, the necessary skills. And then, for example, in Kenya, Kenyans fought against the British for over a decade. You know, in the famous struggle for independence called the Mau Mau movement. So Kenyans fought for 10 years against the British and became independent in 1963. Yeah. And then the other thing is, when we think of these colonial countries, we imagine that these have been colonized for thousands of years. You know, this is actually farther from the truth. You know, because European imperialism was a late kind of imperialism. You know, this was a phenomenon of the late 20th century, and late 19th century and early 20th century. Because some of these European powers imagined themselves as classical Romans. They thought, yeah, we can reinvent ourselves as Roman emperors and generals, and then walk all over other places, you know. And they realized that it was not as easy as they thought it would be. So, for example, Kenya was under the British for only 60 years, you know, which is, you know, just a speck within space of human history, you know. And other countries also were not under the French or Portuguese or Spanish or Dutch tutelage for long periods of time. No. Because as soon as an aggressor goes into somebody else's country, then the people of that country begin actually a movement towards civil disobedience. And civil disobedience comes in different forms. You know, you don't have to throw stones or to do other things, you know. There are different forms. You know, even if by saying, for example, I don't want to dress like you. You know, so that's a form of resistance. You know, I don't want to speak your language. You know, I don't want to have your political system. You know, I want to be my own man or woman. You know, and this is how, you know, anti-colonial movements actually gained momentum. You know, within just a decade or two. You know, and then of course there were other external factors that actually speeded up the process of decolonization. And these external factors were the First and Second World War. You know? Many of you, because you are quite young, actually don't realize that what we call the modern world, you know, the world as it exists now, you know, with the internet, with electricity, with televisions, washing machines, detergents, and all these are phenomena actually of just the period after the Second World War. You know, many of these luxuries were not there, which you actually now take for granted. You know, we were all in the Stone Age. You know, so there's a need, you know, to go and find out about some of these things. You know, you must go and read about the First and Second World War, because these were events that actually changed the world in the shape that we find it today. Because if you don't understand the causes of the First and Second World War, you know, and the impact of these events, you will never understand your modern world. You know, I was rather amused, when I saw the film, which people of my generation, find this quite strange. I could never have the patience of looking at that kind of thing. But of course, this is YouTube and Twitter and other things, which actually affect the way that you think, and also your concentration, and your ability to write, and your ability to absorb things, So, for example, I'm sure right now somebody must be looking at their email or, iPad or a telephone, would ring, this is unimaginable, in certain other places. Like, for example, there are certain special schools, for example, in the United States, in Europe, in places like Britain, where they are grooming their future leaders. Where they are grooming their future leaders. So these people make sure that these students are occupied and their time is never wasted. So if you go to these public schools, for example, in England, and these are actually, they're only public schools in name, but they're actually private schools, and they're expensive. Only the very rich can afford this, or people who get scholarships. So these graduates of these places are the ones who end up at Harvard, at Oxford and Cambridge, and the top universities, in other, the Ivy League places. And these are the kinds of students who acquire both verbal and written skills, because if you read the essays of these students, in the first year, second year, in high school, they are better than some of the essays that you write here at the university. Yes, because from very early on, they come from that kind of background, where they started, they were initiated into the culture of reading from a very early age. They had bedtime stories read to them, by their parents. Almost on a regular basis, almost every day throughout the year. And this is how, they develop their imagination. But many of us actually waste a lot of time. I don't know whether I've said this, you heard me saying this before. Whenever I'm in the library, I'm curious, I walk around the corridors, and I see people very busy, with their computers. They're actually playing games, or twittering, as if this is the most important thing. So they miss the opportunity of actually educating themselves, People like you in other places never do these kinds of things because they don't have time, for things. Like, for example, many of us don't know that if you go to, for example, Cambridge, you go to Oxford, there are no lectures, where you are giving, where a Roger comes and gives you a lecture. No, there's nothing like this. These students go and meet their professors, and they are given assignments to go and do. And they're given a bibliography, to read. And then they come back after 2 weeks, having read 60 books. Yes. And not only having read, they have also written an assignment, an essay, which the professor, goes through, word by word, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, page by page. So how can they be like us? And you will find a lot of these people, these are the people who read the news for you, in Al Jazeera, in CNN and BBC. Those are, the products, I think some of us have seen Radia Omar, the young Somali correspondent or reporter. We work for the BBC, Al Jazeera. He's so good now that he's freelancing. He just asks for his own prize. You know, you don't give him the prize. You know? And of course, he was a product of that kind of institution. He studied history at Oxford. And I actually met his sister in London. And it turned out she was the one who was actually overseeing his education. You know, that he was not wasting his time, you know, in high school and these kinds of places, you know. So again, if you go back to all these early pioneers, you know, of African independence, you find that there were these kinds of people, you know, who were focused, you know, who knew what they wanted, and they knew how to get whatever they wanted. And of course they did. And one of those people, of course, was the first president of my republic, you know, Kenya. This is Kenyatta's biography. You know, this is one of the most wonderful biographies you can actually ever read. You know? And of course, it was written by a BBC correspondent. You know, one of those Oxford graduates, by the way. You know. So the most important thing is, you know, please don't waste your time. You know, you can't be a liberator of any sort. You know, if you don't educate yourself, you know, you need an intellectual base in order to engage with the world. Yeah. And this is something that strikes you first thing, you know, when you go to for example, Britain, or you go to the United States. You know, if you watch television and you watch these talk shows, you find that people are extremely articulate. Hmm? Yeah. They're extremely articulate. They know what they're talking about. You know, and how comes, you know, that did they just drop from the sky? No. You know, yes, because they come from a highly literate society. You know, many of us only know about so-called negative aspects of the West, you know, but very few of us actually know anything about the many positive aspects of Western societies. You know? And of course, this is one of them. You know, that culture of reading, because the level of development of any society, you know, the level of development of any society is commensurate with the seriousness with which they take education, you know, and the proportion of educated people in that society. You know? Look at Japan, yeah? Look at the United States, look at some of these other countries. And why is it, for example, in Africa and in Asia, you know, we have underdevelopment, you know, we have medieval poverty in the 21st century. You know, the poverty there is almost medieval. You know, how come, you know, if only 10% of the population is literate, how on earth do you ever expect to build your nation? You know, if half the population doesn't go to school, how do you ever expect, you know, to, you know, this is a Herculean task. You know, this is almost an impossible kind of thing. You know, so we must not delude ourselves that, you know, somehow things will happen. You know, it will change. You know, why are the Chinese coming to take your resources, for example, in the African continent? You know, it's very simple. Because you don't have people who will be able to exploit those resources. You know, and how come the Chinese are able to do this? You know, just 30 years ago, the Chinese were really no better than us, although they had developed the atomic bomb. You know, but in terms of educational capacity, they were really no better than us. But a very visionary leader, you know, Deng Xiaoping, I don't know if you've ever heard of Deng Xiaoping, you know, sends thousands and thousands of Chinese to the United States to go and study. Yeah? And this after Mao had completely destroyed the intellectual base of Chinese society. You know, and look, who was the role model? You know, for some of our leaders, for example, in Africa, Mao Zedong. You know, so some of these people wanted to develop peasant societies. Can you imagine wanting to develop peasant societies in the 20th century? You know, it's like saying, you know, we want to go back to the medieval period. You know, write with feathers, you know, dip a feather, you know, in ink, and write this, you know, put on skins, you know, of fig leaf, you know. But, you know, some of these people, you know, did good things, you know, in liberating their people, but they did terrible things by not developing the capacities of their societies, you know. And within a span of only, as we said, 30 years, Deng Xiaoping completely transformed China, you know, into a world power, you know. And again, the societies that we emulate, you know, as role models, you know, for us, who are no better than us, you know. If you read, for example, the history of Britain, you know, in Londra, you know, Boke was running around, you know, in the 19th century in the streets, you know, no proper sewers and things. And then, of course, they transformed themselves. They said, you know, we can't live like this. You know, we can't live like this. Yeah. But many of us actually don't ask, you know, just accept things as they are. We think it's okay. You know, when I go back home, you know, I see a filthy toilet, you know. At one time I was with a doctor friend, a very close friend of mine, Allah arhamu, died. And it was called Dr. Buran, a very close friend of mine. So every time I went to Kenya, I was with him. And we used to go for Juma namaz, you know, together. And when you go, when we went, you know, this Imam gave big khutbah, you know, on very, very, you know, philosophical issues. And then I said to Dr. Buran, you know, look at this toilet here. You know, because, you know, as Muslim, when you go to the mosque, you know, you must go as clean, you know, free of nuts. But when you go to that toilet, you come actually with more nuts than when you went in. You know, how come? You know? So we might think, you know, that these are minor things. You know, but they are not minor things. You know, they are actually central to what being human is all about. You know, what being civilized is all about. You know, and we think, you know, these are normal. You know, it's a normal thing, but no, this is not a normal thing. You know, and there are people like who never accepted this kind of situation. You know, people like Lee Kuan Yew, you know, Singapore. He transformed that country, you know, from third world to first world within a very, very short period of time. And of course, it was really education, you know, more than anything else, you know. So even if you decolonize, you know, if you don't know what you want to do with your independence, you know, people will come and take your resources, you know, because you will have to give them these resources, you know, partly because you can't exploit these resources yourselves because you don't have the skills necessary to do this. And then, whether it is oil, whether it is copper, or whatever it is, these are resources that every human society must benefit from. You know? So we can't say, okay, we're going to punish the Americans, you know, or the Europeans by not stopping oil, you know. Of course, they'll come and bomb you. You know, yes, it's a natural thing. You know, why should they not come and bomb you? They should come and bomb you because their societies will come to a standstill. You know, where was the internet invented? In Jeddah? in the mum where the oil comes from? No. You know? And what you require are intellectual skills. Skills are the most important things. You know, if you don't have skills, then you'll never get anywhere. Okay, I think I will stop here because I have other commitments I have to go to. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
I would like on your behalf to thank Professor Bakari for this insightful speech. We'd like, I mean, we could never dream of any other inaugural speech better than this, so thank you so much for this. We have another meeting next Friday, inshallah. It will be a Fatih academic debate. It will be on the issue of evolution and its representation in